my personal opinion is that the momentum around this whole climate change agenda now is such that it's beyond one man or one country to stop or to influence in a hugely negative way. We see that since the Paris negotiations, there's been a real shift, I think, and certainly you see it in the business community, and Acciona's directly involved in all of these negotiations. We're in Paris, we're in Marrakesh now. And what we see is that there is huge momentum, and we see the private sector really getting on board in a big way. And the fact is that today, renewables economically are more compelling. New build solar, new build wind is more cost competitive than new build coal or gas. Not only that, there is no fuel price risk, so we don't pay for the sun and the wind, it comes for free and it's forever. In making a transition, so the science tells us that we need to leave around 80% of our fossil fuel resources on this planet in the ground if we're going to stay within the 2-degree limit. So to be blunt, we have to stop burning coal to produce electricity. This is critical. To achieve that, we need to decarbonise the world's electricity systems by around 2050. And that seems like a big deal, and it is a big deal. But the reality is that we have the technology today to do it. We have the wherewithal. There are big challenges, of course, in going down that path. Let's not kid ourselves, but it can be done. And it must be done, because we cannot allow this climate crisis to get the better of us.
Well, you mentioned that Australia has recently ratified the Paris Treaty, but without making those changes, how likely are we to meet those obligations that we've signed on to keep it under 2% warming, to invest in renewables? There doesn't seem to be that sort of urgency politically at the moment.
Well, I think you were asking Kirsty earlier on about state governments, for example, and we're seeing evidence of state governments in this country as well as in the US and elsewhere taking the initiative. This state of Victoria has announced a target of 40% renewables by 2025, and so that's a big undertaking, and they're legislating changes to make that happen. That obviously, that's something that needs to be managed carefully, but we're seeing this kind of thing happen more and more, where states the provinces are starting to take the initiative. We're also seeing the private sector stand up and make a difference. I mean, Kirsty, you mentioned NAB's announcement. The financial community now is making clear choices about where to put its money. Corporations, big brands like IKEA, Google, Apple are now procuring their power directly from renewable energy sources, so they're going straight to the endpoint, making clear choices. We're seeing more and more of this, and I think it should give us cause for optimism, and it should be a reason just to keep pushing harder and harder.
And Justin, in terms of your work with some of the mitigation that we can all become part of, it's not only about, we've spent a bit of time talking about the challenges, but what are some of the solutions that your research is coming up with?
I guess the light at the end of the tunnel is that the types of things we do to have to adapt and sort of embrace the inevitability that fire's part of our landscape, and it is going to become more frequent, is completely sort of synergistic with moving to a low carbon lifestyle. Like, there's no clashes at all. Decentralising our power grid means that we can have power during natural disasters. Moving away from sort of open cut coal mines means that they're not susceptible to fire and having the power sort of cut to the city. Capturing water on site using your roof means you've got a water supply that helps you respond and use that in a bushfire. And all of these things are actually synergistic. And I guess the other good news is that the types of fires we're seeing at the moment, like Black Saturday and Ash Wednesday, are really pertinent and clear lessons about what we're going to see in the future. So we know what we need to design against. We just have to admit that that's part of our environment and actually live with that. And unfortunately, the inevitability it's going to be a fair bit more common in our future while we sort of slow the whole
And Kirsty, in terms of, obviously you work very closely with youth involved in the climate change movement, and we do see consistently that it's young people who get it, young people that are motivated, they have a very strong understanding of the urgency of this, and unfortunately though they're often not in voting positions or positions of power and influence in companies. How do you keep young people activated and motivated even when they're a little bit outside the political power structures?
Yeah, totally. I think this is a massive part of the injustice of climate change, that it's young people who will inherit the consequences of decisions being made today, yet have no formal way in which to influence those decisions in either government or business or in their communities. So at the AYCC, what we do is we build young people to have the skills, the networks, the confidence, the knowledge they need to lead change in their communities. And that looks like everything from, there was a high school student in grade 11 in Adelaide who said, I want to get solar in my school, but the state government said, no, we bulk buy our power. Then went with a solar company and got the grid involved and got the education department together, got them all in a room to make a plan for how schools can go solar. And was successful in getting his business plan up in his school, which is really incredible, right through to looking at what are the biggest threats to our future, which in Australia we are one of the biggest polluters per person in the entire developed world. We are one of the world's largest exporters of coal and gas, with plans to continue to expand both over the coming years. And something like the Adani coal mine is something young people across the country be united about, saying this is a line in the sand. You can't open one of the world's largest coal reserves, build mega mines that are 40 kilometres long, so from here to the airport and back again, and then ship that coal out of the Great Barrier Reef. Like, this is enough. And that's the line young people across the country have drawn. And this week we've seen the Queensland government, or last week, change the laws just for Adani. And we've got the decision maker in federal government in charge of $5 billion for Northern Australia publicly campaigning in support of these coal mines. So there's definitely a lot of work, and the vested interest we saw in California are just as live and ripe here. But as young people, it's how do we get out into communities, raise awareness, talk to the banks who will have to finance this, talk to our governments, get active in raising awareness in the lead up to elections, and ultimately provide the vision and hope for what a better world can look like. Because young people, hope is not just a gift and a strength, it's a real necessity.
Absolutely. And Andrew, we mentioned before that at the moment in Morocco, we've got the latest round of climate talks happening that Acpion is involved in. What is your company hoping will be some of the positive outcomes from these latest talks?
I think there's a real hope that we'll see a continuation of the momentum. We talk a bit about the Paris hangover, and effectively what that means is, after Paris, where we exceeded our expectations as a global community, there was a great party and a great sense, well, we've achieved it. But in reality, as many will say, is that we've really only just started the journey. So what we hope for as a business is that the momentum continues and increases, and it's pretty simple. It's nothing more complicated than that.
And to obviously we've talked about some very heavy, serious, big global issues to do with climate change tonight, but to leave everyone with a sense of something that within their companies and their workplaces and their homes that they can activate to actually make a contribution to this climate change problem. What suggestions would the panellists have that everyone can take away, something simple and individual that they can do to make a difference? Can I start with you, maybe, Justin?
I think just a simple shift of attitude in terms of sort of acceptance that it's happening, rather than sort of, if my neighbour doesn't do it, I don't need to do it sort of approach to maybe turning around and being the advocate or the driver or the first person on the street to sort of change and demonstrate is probably the most liberating thing sort of I do and feel as a researcher and as an individual. So take the step, make the journey. It's a great one.
And Kirsty, your advice or suggestion?
Yeah, great. So one of the things when we work with young people is we find we're not actually educating them on climate change, because young people already mostly know about the problem. We're educating them that they can make a difference, and I think that is the hardest thing to believe as a young person, but I think as any person confronted with the climate science and confronted with the scale of the vested interests who have been holding back progress for decades. But you know, we are on this we are in the great disruption, shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and scientists call this the critical decade. You know, it's the critical decade because we're starting to see the impacts of climate change, but it's also the critical decade because this is when we need to act on climate change. This 5-year window is the time we need to turn the ship around, and that looks, you know, from in the top of big businesses, it's like changing the way you invest in fossil fuels and thinking about how you mitigate climate and become an advocate, right through to in our communities, how do we switch to community renewable energy or advocate in our sphere of influence. And there are so many community groups and this powerful movement of people all across the country who are looking at what are the skills and networks I have and how do I have the biggest influence. And so it'll be different for each person, but I guess on top of that, I would really ask everyone to think, like at the end of the day, this crisis is so unjust, and it's often those who are worst affected who are leading this, whether it's, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in the Northern Territory fighting gas, whether it's farmers across the country locking their gate, or whether it's young people getting out there, and just thinking about how you can support those communities who are most affected by climate change to have their voice heard and be making a difference.
Terrific. And Andrew, what would be an action that you would recommend?
Well, probably a couple of things. I would say firstly that we should stop waiting for governments to solve this challenge for us, first and foremost. I think there's a lot that we can do as individuals, as communities, as society, without, you know, the need to rely on government. But the second thing I say, and I reflect on our company and Acciona, I think that the big thing that's happened at Acciona over the last decade or so, and I look at our shareholders, a relatively small group, really came to understand this issue very clearly, and they made a conscious choice that in this business that I represent tonight, that we would try and make a difference in the world. And so we attempt to try and make a difference by demonstrating a model of a sustainable business. We attempt to make a difference by trying to raise awareness, and so on and so forth. So I would say to all of the, let's say, the business people in the audience, go back to your businesses and ask yourself the question, how can I make a difference in my business? And it might not be an easy thing to answer, and maybe it's only a small thing that you can change, but little by little we can bring change.
Yeah, terrific. Oh, well, there's some wonderful